Thanks again for all of you being here, because it's just fantastic to talk to my sisters who are so knowledgeable. And I think I didn't realize before I came that there will be so many of you here who are a similar age to me. I thought there'd be a younger audience, so a lot of you will know exactly everything that I'm going to say. But maybe we can have a discussion of how different it was in the UK from in the US, because I think there will be some significant differences. One of the things, the main thing I guess that I'm going to address today is this thing that I've heard said, which is that social media is a movement. I don't know if you've heard that. I have heard young women feminists say social media is a movement. That is their activism, it is their movement, and even some slightly older women but are new to the game. So that's what I want to talk about, is comparing what we had in the women's liberation movement with what's going on today to see if it is a movement. If it isn't a movement, social media, then how do we build a movement? And how do we potentially get some lessons from what was going on at the time of lesbian feminism in the women's liberation movement towards building a kind of media that will help a movement develop. Okay? Now, some of what I'm going to talk about comes from the book of mine, the new book that's coming out on the 29th of August, which is The Lesbian Revolution, Lesbian Feminism in the UK, 1970 to 1990. I don't know what it's like in North America, but in Britain there has been no documentation of lesbian feminism as a movement in its own right. What's been happening in the States? Has there been documentation in book form of lesbian feminism as a movement? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, Bonnie Morris, I know, and I use her book, of course. But I know that, yeah. But I'm thinking of the whole thing. What was it about? When did it develop? What are the important dates? No. Okay, I suspect that isn't anywhere, but particularly not in the UK. And I look up books of the history of women's liberation, and the word lesbian is not in the index. Even books written by lesbians recently, the word lesbian is not in the index. So my understanding of lesbian feminism is that it was the beating heart of the women's liberation movement, the sine qua non of the women's liberation movement. It created the energy, as I explain in the book, of the violence against women movement, and in Britain, and I'm sure here too, created an extraordinary analysis of sexuality and of heterosexuality and so on, which was completely buried, because the last chapter of my book is Demise. It's called Grief, the Demise of Lesbian Feminism, and it tries to look at not only why did it die in the 80s, but the extraordinary grief that so many of us felt at the fact that it had died, because we had known nothing like it and thought that it would go on forever. And very many of you here, I'm sure, are extremely aware of what I'm talking about. So in the book, I use interviews with 12 of the lesbian feminists I knew of the time, one of whom is Julie Bindel, in fact. And I also use archive material in feminist archives in the UK. And I use my own archive, got a huge amount of books and materials from the time that I've not yet donated to an archive. Not all of mine, I've given a few away, but most of them not. So I've got stuff that I think is really quite interesting. So I'm going to talk about some of the material from that, and also I have my last PhD student, Jess McGarry, who has interviewed some of the women in this room, in fact, is just pretty much finished her PhD on comparing feminist use of the media, women's liberation in the media, then and now. And she's particularly been interviewing some women who go over both eras and what they think about the media then and media now, and so on. So I'll just give you a brief recap of what's in my book, so you get a sense of what I mean by trying to write a book about a movement. At the beginning of the book, I have a section on the origin and ideas and practices of lesbian feminism. So I have a chapter on origins, where did it come from, slightly about where the women's liberation movement in Britain came from, and then how lesbian feminism came out of that and how it developed. I've got a chapter on separatism and how absolutely fundamental separatism was to the women's liberation movement, again, could not have existed without it, and how there was no questioning at all of the women-only principle in the 1970s, but now it's impossible to have a meeting, of course, which is women-only. I've got a chapter on culture, and so it was wonderful what Anne Menashe was saying in the other room about the importance of culture to movements. So I talk about the women's culture and how the words of the songs had the politics in them, and so on and so on. So the culture and the politics were totally interrelated, and the culture was fundamental. In Britain, of course, we didn't really have women's festivals like you had here, but of course we had the presses and the books and the theatre groups and the bands and so on and so on, a huge number. And there were women's discos going on every night of the week in London, sometimes more than one. And we lived, it was our whole lives. We were total immersion, and the culture was the basis of the politics, and all of those things were bound up together. I don't know how we managed to do jobs, but I was running from my work to meetings and discos every night of the week. The cat litter was falling all the way down the back stairs because I never had time to change it. I mean, that was the situation. Okay, so, and then I've got a chapter on what I call the lesbian perspective after Julia Penelope, who of course wrote about the lesbian perspective, talking about a distinctive lesbian perspective and what makes it distinctive. I talk about the lesbian perspective as applied to male violence and male sexual violence, because of course a lesbian feminist was so crucial in all of those struggles. Now, none of this is written, you understand. I mean, you could read about and learn about the women's liberation movement and not know there was ever a lesbian in it. That is the situation. So my interviewees, for instance, say that they do think that the fact that there were not men in our lives and that we were separatists, made it absolutely so much easier to develop the analysis of male violence and get involved in that work. And of course, we were wholeheartedly in that work. We didn't have housework to do for men, boy children to rear. In those days, we didn't have children. Lesbians didn't have children. That might be another discussion. But it is one of the differences that creates a very different situation today. And then I've got a whole section on lesbian ethics and the journal Lesbian Ethics and lesbian philosophy, and Sarah Hoagland is in there, and so on and so on, and how crucial it is to recognize lesbian feminist philosophy, which is just gone. It was so marvelous a plant. It was so beautiful, and it's all gone. Okay, but my hope is that women will read this book and think, yes, we can get those books. We can start to begin to think of what could possibly happen again. Then I've got a whole chapter on political lesbianism and the analysis of heterosexuality, which is something which is very, very badly needed now, because as I think some women have been saying in discussions at this conference already, there's a developing view amongst many lesbians that lesbianism is born, that you cannot choose to be a lesbian, that anybody who's been near the penis is somehow a false lesbian. I've been accused myself of not being a lesbian. 40 years doesn't do it. And of course, I mean, it has to be said that all of the major theorists of radical feminism, pretty much, that we can think of, were indeed lesbians and lesbian feminists. We wouldn't have them because a lot of them had probably seen penises in their lives. And if people don't really understand what I'm saying, I say, well, the penis was there in the beginning. You may not recognize being near a penis, but a penis entered your mother's body, and that's how you got to be born. So it really makes me cross all this stuff. So I've got a whole chapter on that, trying to encourage and support a new generation of young women to become lesbian feminists, because they're afraid to do so. They're getting told off in the lesbian community. How dare you assume? How dare you assume? So that's the first half of the book, which is all the sort of really positive stuff. And then I go into the less positive stuff. So I look at what I consider to be the biggest force in destroying the movement, which was the development of lesbian sadomasochism. And I'm sure that many of you in this room will be very, very familiar with how that worked. In London, the situation with lesbian sadomasochism was, it came over from here, of course, 1979, What Colour Is Your Handkerchief? And then coming to power, we immediately started getting involved in speaking at conferences against it in the UK, but we couldn't believe, I mean, there was a grief in that, an extraordinary grief, that we'd put all of this energy into the total reconstruction of sexuality, the deconstruction of male sexuality, trying to create a whole new world in which we would love each other differently as the very basis of the possibility of the liberation of women, and along came a whole political movement of sadomasochism, based on all our principles, apparently, trying to use the language we'd created and so on. So in 1984, when there was trouble at the new London Lesbian and Gay Centre, set up with a great deal of money, but there was a question of whether the sadomasochists could move there, could meet there. We set up a group in London called LASM, Lesbians Against Sadomasochism, out of which came a great deal of stuff, including my paper, Sadomasochism, the Erotic Cult of Fascism, which was published in Lesbian Ethics in this country, right? So, but it came to the point where, of course, in London, I don't know about here, there was a much wearing of swastikas. And we were told, the critics, that a swastika is a Hindu fertility symbol. And we said, well, why do you wear it with a Nazi black leather cap? Because, you know, it doesn't go with Hinduism. But they were everywhere. And what's so interesting is that they were in many respects, that movement was destructive of us in the way that the transgender rights movement is today, because they staked out our meetings. They said nothing about us without us. They would come into meetings, like 12 of them, in the swastikas and the black leather costume, and stand there and loom over us. They destroyed our marches. They destroyed the Lesbian Pride March, and so on. So it was absolutely huge, although the vast majority of feminist groups and organizations tried to keep them out and had policies against them, and groups like Lesbian Line and so on struggled for years to try and deal with that threat. I say it destroyed the movement pretty much. I mean, it was closely accompanied by the butch and femme stuff. Because butch and femme is just a slightly milder form of lesbian sadomasochism. It's you know, comes from the same erotic values of power, dominance, and submission, and so on. And you know, I haven't even got to media, so I better do that. So by 1990, in the Socialist Feminist Journal, and that's media, but it's the Socialist Feminist media in Britain, there was a piece called Revolutionary Feminism, Sheila Jeffries' Revolutionary Feminism and the De-Eroticization of the Women's Liberation Movement. I'm supposed to have de-sexed feminism pretty much on my own, right? In 1991, I left the country. Things were getting a bit hot, but also I couldn't get a job in academia. So it was getting pretty bad. And then there's a chapter in the book on identity politics, a group in Britain called South All Black Sisters, which still exists. I've got it as the title of the identity politics chapter. They said in 1986 about the way that identity politics was destroying feminist activism, the CIA couldn't have done it better. Right? So that's the title of that chapter. And then I've got a chapter at the end on, as I say, Demise, what actually happened to, what were the final chinks in that were destroying us, including Section 28 in London, which was passed by the Conservative government, and forbade the promotion of homosexuality. But by that stage, what was extraordinary was, I don't know what's happening here, but in London and other places in Britain, there were lesbian feminists creating in London with grants from the local government, pamphlets on challenging heterosexuality to go into schools. Right? They were running lesbian youth groups. Today, what's going into schools is transgenderism, the enforced subservience to girl children who might like to be lesbians, to the idea of gender, and putting them on the road to being transsex. So it's a complete opposite from, 1988, challenging heterosexism in schools, that going in there and teachers teaching it in schools, to now it's almost impossible to be a lesbian. So we're in a very different place. And it was a pushback by the Conservative government that was huge. Okay, so that's it for a little rundown. It's a swift rundown, and I'm sure I haven't covered everything that you needs to be covered in looking at a movement, but you had to start somewhere. There was nothing, and so I have made a start. So in terms of, is social media a movement? Well, I know it was the case here, and it was certainly the case in Britain, that media, newsletters in particular, was set up in huge profusion in the early 1970s and all the way through. And every local town had a newsletter. Even small towns had newsletters. They also had groups. Can you imagine that? Women's groups. And now the problem today is that the social media is said to be a revolution because people think of Arab Spring All those people came out on the square. They don't talk about, and all those women got viciously raped and attacked on that square, so it was never a revolution anything to do with women. But also, where has it got us, right? Wonderful example of social media activism, and things are pretty bad in the Middle East, right? When our magazine culture, our newsletter culture set off, took place, it was like wildfire. But the main difference between now and then, of course, as the basis of movement, is that feminist and lesbian feminist organizing was face-to-face. Women got together and it was face-to-face. The first contact a woman had with feminism was likely to be a meeting, a conference, or an event for women only. And now women's first contact with feminism is likely to be online. And in the UK in particular, though, things have started to happen again. You know, I can cheerfully say I am hopeful, because there are the beginnings of women's groups beginning to be set up all around the country as a result of activism against the campaign of transgender rights against women's rights. So there's two organisations in Britain, We Need to Talk and Women's Space UK, who are organising meetings up and down the country. Women come out of those meetings and they're forming women-only groups in their neighbourhoods, and there is a rage which is wonderful to behold. So you really feel, and I really feel, something is happening again. I'm not sure it's happening yet here in quite the same way, but look, this is happening here. So that's pretty exciting. But the situation now is that the women who are coming off social media to try and find women, and I see it like this coming down, you know, into the real world, they are saying that they know nobody in their towns. I mean, nobody. Can you imagine that? In the 70s, every little town had several groups on different issues, all women-only groups. The idea that you couldn't find somebody in your town was completely absurd. At the time of the women's liberation movement in the UK, feminist media were the product of a movement. They didn't create a movement, and they weren't a movement. They were the product of a movement. And of course, they were not owned by men. They were not platforms controlled by men. Women were not being thrown out off them or closed down if they said the wrong thing, like a man was not a woman, and so on. So there was an extraordinary freedom in the forms of media that we were creating ourselves with our Gestetner machines. Now, the culture that we had at the time, as I say, was crucially important. And I don't know what we're going to do without, we haven't got women's presses, we haven't got women's bookstores. The newsletters were obviously sold through the women's bookstores, they were circulated through the women's bookstores, women went into the bookstores to find out information, women would tell them where groups were, all that kind of stuff. So there was local activism possible, whereas now women are having to make do with knowing somebody in Nova Scotia and somebody else. It is actually not the same in any way. So the social media does not provide a culture. It simply doesn't provide a culture, and is not able to do that. It cannot provide the women's bands playing at women-only venues, including and promoting our politics through their songs. One of the bands that came to talk to the lesbian history group that I've been involved with in London was talking about going to Germany and playing to an audience of 3,000 women, and we're thinking, my goodness, how is that possible? It's hard to imagine now that those sorts of things were possible. But they included lesbian and feminist theatre, women-only discos, art exhibitions, wonderful posters by feminist lesbian poster collectives, the production of Labrador's earrings, badges, wall hangings. All of our homes contained similar artifacts. They're called common cultural reference. So you'd go into a woman's home and you would know who she was, and it was all over the walls, and we all had the same stuff. It's true, isn't it? It's true, yes. The culture was created and promoted through the women-only conferences that took place, national, regional, per city, on specific issues, lesbian conferences, black women's conferences, black lesbians conferences. Women's culture was formed was formed from women-only spaces. Now, for women need to be able to meet, and I think that one of the things that happens when women meet, of course, is that common cultural values and common appearance norms, interestingly enough, are created. And quite a lot of the women you find who are quite prominent on social media do not look as we would have looked in those days. Right? I know there's also differences between Britain and America. In America, there was more femininity done in feminism than there ever was in Britain. And I can remember early in the 1980s, we had a woman from an anti-pornography group in the States come and speak to our group in London, Women Against Violence Against Women, and she was wearing a kilt and lipstick and long hair and makeup. And we were so surprised, all of us, we couldn't speak. I mean, we're just sort of... Huh? It was heart-stopping, because we could not imagine anything like it. So nobody in Britain who called themselves a feminist in those days did have that particular costume. But also there was a common costume, because when you come together, you learn ethics, ways to relate to each other, ways to love each other, ways to have relationships, as well as ways to look, all of those things which cannot happen online. So there's a creation of a common culture in that way, which I really, really, really miss at the moment, and I don't know how we're going to start to create it again, only through women coming together. And the other thing I have to say to you is, only through women coming together as women are we going to have a rebirth of lesbian feminism, because, guess what, it's quite hard to get the fierce excitement of loving other women online. I mean, it has to be, in a group where you see how wonderful women are, how strong they are, how absolutely brilliant they are, and there's that erotic excitement that pulses through the room and has women falling into each other's arms. It doesn't happen online, right? So for the development of lesbian feminism, again, we've obviously got to come offline, and we have to be in a position to hold each other's hands. Now, the most of the newsletters, as indeed most of the stuff that was going on, I would like to say, although it's going to perhaps be controversial, was actually, it was created by lesbians. It was lesbians who were doing it. Lesbians had the time. They didn't have to go up and go home and make anybody's dinner. It was a 24-hour thing for us. I mean, that's what the feminism was. Now, in terms of how women-only the meetings were, in 1981, I think it was, the Women's Press put on a launch of Mary Daly's book, Pornography, Men Possessing Women, at Conway Hall, which was an ordinary public venue. It was women only. It said it on the flyer that the publishers put out. In 2012, we had a conference pulled at Conway Hall, partly because I was due to speak, and the transgender activist said that I was like David Irving, the Holocaust denier, in other words, a Nazi. So, we've come a long way. 1981, women only, completely normal to have large meetings, and Mary Daly spoke there, and so on and so on. Now, a problem I'm very concerned about, and I've heard other women speaking about today, is theory development. Now, theory development happened through the media that we had at the time. Theory development happened in several ways. One way was the conference paper, which is a form of media in itself. We don't have conferences now, so we don't have to worry about conference papers. And also conferences are terribly different now because you have speakers like me sitting here. We didn't have speakers in Britain. There were no speakers at any conferences in the 1970s or in the 1980s. We had conferences, and what happened was women on their own or in small groups would produce conference papers. We would write them the night before, 500 words or 2 sides of A4. A4 is this size paper. And we would then, we would type them, and then we'd type them onto those Gestetner sheets that have got sort of holes punched in them that the ink's going to come through, and then we'd go to the Women's Centre the next day, and we'd run off the papers, we'd take them to the conference, we'd put them on the tables at the front of the conference, everybody coming in would pick up a paper and go to the workshop to discuss it. So there were not speakers. So this is what I want to see again, and I don't know how it's going to happen, that the theory development, the excitement of the ideas comes from the women who are becoming involved in a movement, not top down from the women who are supposed to be the ones who speak at the conferences. I don't know how we're going to get there. Also, I don't know how we're going to get the confidence again the fact that women felt able to do this, to write the two sides of A4, and you'd get loads of these papers at conferences, very, very badly typed, it has to be said, and almost illegible. But women had the guts and the chutzpah and the confidence to actually do it, whereas now we have a generation of young people who have very, very, very little confidence, would think it would be impossible to imagine, running off a conference paper in that way. So women did the conference papers, they had their ideas in them. At the next conference they might reply, or they reply in the newsletter, or the newsletter publishes the paper immediately. One of the papers that created a certain amount of fuss was the Political Lesbian paper, which was produced at a conference in 1979, a revolutionary feminist conference. I was in revolutionary feminism. Don't ask me how it's different from radical feminism. If we've got time later on, I might be able to tell you. But I was the founder of something called revolutionary feminism, which was the tendency in women's liberation at that time. So the Political Lesbian paper was then published in Wires, which was a national women's liberation newsletter. It was then put together in a pamphlet from Only Women's Press, which was a lesbian press, and therefore all that discussion happened. It was put together in the pamphlet with lots of replies to it, and it was a source of a huge amount of discussion. And if you read other sources from the time, women are saying, I'm reading the Political Lesbian paper, this is what I think about it. So a furious discussion, certainly I think as furious as anything that's happening online right now, around that sort of material, okay? So we did conference papers, we did lengthy pieces for the newsletters, for the London Women's Liberation newsletter, for Wires. We didn't do books, really. The Americans did books and we read them. The American radical feminist lesbians did books. I don't think women in Britain had the confidence quite to do that. I'm not quite sure why it was, but we read the books. And of course, we discussed all the ideas, and we did lots of ideas of our own. I think the Political Lesbian paper was pretty innovative, and certainly the sort of ideas about sexuality that we started creating then, particularly through a lesbian newsletter called the Rev Rad newsletter. It's not online, it's not everywhere, and that is another problem I'll come to in a moment. But if we think about something like, we had a conference on violence against women, whose papers are in a book. They are in a book, because sometimes the papers made it into a book called Women Against Violence Against Women. The way we were discussing violence against women at the time, it was everything. It was first sexual intercourse or sexual initiation as rape. It was sexual harassment at work, sexual fantasies, a huge array of forms of sexual violence against women. This was 1980. Now, there's no way we're getting back to that stage at the moment. We aren't anywhere near it. Rape is a discussion, but all this other stuff's not there. It's not there, is it? And we're not talking about sexual initiation, fantasies. I haven't seen any discussion about fantasies. Sadomasochism, which, we was discussing fantasies because of that. We had to be talking about all of those things. It's not there. There's absolutely nothing going on. So the theory formation at the time was coming from a wide range of women, a wide range of confident women who are putting it together. The book I wrote, Spinsters and Enemies, in 1985, why did I write that? Well, because in the 1970s I was only doing conference papers. Oh, good conference papers. There's a lot in them, but they were short. Like the need for revolutionary feminism in 1977 and so on. And in the late 1970s, a woman said to me, she came up to me at a conference and said, Sheila, I think you could write a book, and you should write a book. And I thought, me? What? But that's where I started. So what I mean is we've got to create that groundwork where women are being able to do the two sides of A4, moving towards being able to produce the books, and I don't think that's happening very much. And in terms of social media today, I know there's Feminist Current, which does have theoretical pieces, but otherwise there's really nothing, is there? And social media obviously doesn't. Social media is sound bites. I mean, there's obviously not theory formation in social media. There's lots of aggression and there's lots of other things that are quite a problem, but there is not theory formation. And in terms of what other theory we need to create, well, a lot of young women today are looking back to those books from those times and they're reading them. They're getting the second-hand cheap copies and they're reading them, which is absolutely great. But these are new times and there are new problems. And young women have got to be addressing and doing theory on those problems. And somebody asked me this morning what they thought one of those problems was, and I said mental health, because, the whole discussion and critique of mental health's gone. The feminist critique of mental health's gone. Young women don't even know there was one. So, but it's huge now for young women. They're all getting these diagnoses. They don't know that we rejected diagnoses, so we rejected therapy, we rejected the medical profession. We decided that therapy was one of the things that destroyed the women's liberation movement, which is what I say in this book, right? All of those things are just so accepted now. So there are different circumstances that women have to deal with, and they need to create their own analyses of what is happening right at the present. Shout out to me a couple of other topics. Yes? Yes?
How did you come to write the transsexual empire?
I didn't write the transsexual. No, I don't. No. Okay, I'll rush to the end, and then you can ask me questions, but not that one. Okay. Yes. Pseudonyms was a problem at the time, but it was a different problem. Now women use pseudonyms so that they can be safe on social media. At the time, women used pseudonyms because they were forced into it by a view around in the movement that there should not be stars. Every idea in the movement came from all the women in the movement. Right? So nobody should claim an idea at all. Nobody should claim an idea. Therefore, it was a good idea to use pseudonyms. I was mildly horrified by this, partly because I was a historian, and of course, you actually need to know who somebody is and what they said and how those ideas mature and develop and what they go on to do and who the hell they are. And also, I wrote a paper about it for the Revrad newsletter, indeed, at the time, explaining all the reasons why pseudonyms were not a good idea. And I explained that, women lost their names in marriage, as slaves lost their names to their owners, and they took their owners' names. And it just seemed terrible that women should be losing their names to pseudonyms. There wasn't a lot of it about, and some of them were nice. There was Catherine McKindo called herself Insubordinate Clause, which I quite liked, or I Clause. Isn't that lovely? Which was absolutely terrific. But there wasn't a lot. We got so fed up with pseudonyms that once we were in York Cathedral, we went to some meeting. We only ever went to meetings. That's the only way I ever saw towns. And we were going around the cathedral. We had to sign the visitor's book. And I think a friend of ours at the time wanted to call herself Stream. And we thought this is a very bad idea. And so, because, we weren't hippies, any of us. And so we decided we'd make up names. And I called myself, I said, well, make up a name that really talks about what I actually do in my daily life. And so I called myself London Transport Jeffries, because I was always on the tube. And another very good friend of mine, Sandra McNeil, the name she chose for herself was Date of Next Meeting, because she was the one at the end of every meeting who said, what is the date of the next meeting? So you can see we didn't like all this stuff, Sky and Swallow and Stream and goodness knows what. But pseudonyms are obviously differently used today, and they're used for security in a way that we absolutely didn't have to. We didn't have problems with security. 1978, the London Women's Liberation newsletter, I had a meeting arranged at my flat, so I put my phone number and my address in the Women's Liberation newsletter. I mean, can you imagine? Yeah, it was normal. It was normal. No men bothered us, no men followed us, no men picketed us. But that brings me on to another problem and difference between then and now, is that most of our newsletters were women only. They were not for men, and men did not read them. That is for radical feminists, let's say. Socialist feminists felt a bit differently, and there were a couple of things that did come out publicly, Spare Rib, but mostly they were women only. So only women were allowed to read them. If they were in women's bookshops, they had to be under the counter for you to be able to buy them, and they went out by circulation. Women sat and stuck the stamps on everything. So we were able to have discussions, maybe, that went a lot further because we were not stopped. We were not stopped by men surveilling us. We were not interrupted by anybody else's eyes but our own, and so the ideas could fly. They could develop in extraordinary ways. But the problem with that is nobody knows those ideas now. The ideas developed in the Revrad newsletter, nobody's heard of, nobody knows where they are. They are in the archives, and maybe we need to try and make some of them, visible to other people. But the people who did get their ideas out there were the socialist feminists, because they didn't bother about whether men could see them. And also, the media were able to pick what they wanted. So they picked sadomasochism. In the 1980s, all of the left and progressive media picked sadomasochism. The Guardian newspaper, Time Out and City Limits, there were entertainment magazines. Of course, all the gay magazines and all those that saw themselves as progressive, liberation this, liberation that, they all had pictures of lesbian sadomasochism. They had women on their knees sucking off dildos attached to women in black leather. And it was huge, absolutely huge. So they finished off the possibility that we could critique sexuality. And of course, they didn't want to have pictures of us because actually jeans and t-shirts aren't terribly exciting. And there was no way the straight media were ever going to, non-feminist media, ever going to cover us. So it's an interesting question for us to discuss, is the difference between the women only, which allowed an extraordinary construction of theory in particular, and the fact that they were women only, therefore nobody knows that those ideas ever existed. I think that's a serious problem for us to think about. Sorry? Really? We never had that. It was just jeans. We also had, in all of those media, a policy of no personal attacks, and I think it worked. Do you know that? There was no going after individual women by name. You were only supposed to critique the ideas and not the woman. I really think it worked pretty damn well. And you can't do that on social media. Nobody gives a damn, and there's just a free-for-all, which is extraordinary and very, very frightening to a lot of young women who'd like to become involved in the movement. I think I'm getting to the end. I just need to say something about the identity politics and the end of the London Women's Liberation newsletter. The London Women's Liberation newsletter was absolutely crucial to our movement. At its height, it had about 800 subscribers, but also it was much shared. It was in women's centres and so on. All the meetings were advertised in it. It was hugely important. And women wrote opinion pieces, developed theory, etc., etc. But in the 1980s, the development of identity politics had quite a severe impact. Up until the early 1980s, the Women's Liberation newsletter was created by any women who were around at the time. There was kind of a collective, but women would come in and help to run it off, type stuff up if women couldn't type, do all of that, send it out the next day. It was just an absolutely loose collective that went for 12 years, very, very successfully. But with the development of identity politics, it changed. In the early 1980s, a group of women set themselves up as the Editorial Committee, and they said that they were a group of black women. It was organized by a woman who was in fact Sephardic Jewish and Irish. Irish at the time in London qualified as black because black was an umbrella term which meant all persons oppressed by imperialism, right? That didn't happen here, I think, did it? It was a specifically British thing. So Irish was in black at the time. And Sephardic Jewish, but not Ashkenazi Jewish, I think, for some reason, there was a distinction made. Sorry? And, sorry? Yep. Yeah, I know. And so the women who were not in the collective of black women who were doing the editorial policy from then onwards were given the task of the running off the newsletter. They could come in and do the grunt work, right? And they were Gentile women and so on. Now, the problem with this is that within a very short time, the circulation went from 800 to 150. But a particular reason it went to 150 was that this group of women who had taken over running the collective, and I mean, yeah, tyranny of structurelessness. How did we let that happen? But it could happen. We'd all just worked as a collective. We'd all been volunteers, and it was done. And there was nothing we could do. So a problem was that there was a group of women called Sisters Against Disablement, working on disability, who were very, very far ahead in their ideas about what needed to happen, lesbians again, mostly. And they produced a disability access code so that if you wanted to organize a meeting in London, you had to go through the 18 questions and the 6 parts of each question, answering them all in terms of what it meant for the disabled. So this was each individual woman organizing a meeting. There were no council blocks or any buildings that had disability access codes. It was all ahead of its time. It would be different now. So you had to do things, whether it was in your home or at a building, and the building might be at the other side of London, would take an hour and a half to get there, an hour and a half to get back. But you had to take your pad and your measurers. You had to measure the width of the steps, the height of the steps, the material on the flooring, the width of the doors, the kind of taps, and so on. It was very, 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 very detailed. So, surprise, surprise, any meetings, adverts that fell down on any of these particulars were not published. So they were sometimes holding back about 23 a week, you know. So what happened was, by 1985, when the newsletter collapsed, there was I think there was one edition that had 15 pages of disability access code and 4 pages of other content. So it was gone, it was gone. There was a last meeting in 1985 about what was to be done because the newsletter wasn't really surviving anymore. And the women who were in the collective who'd been running the thing said that unless a group of black women could be found who were prepared to take on that newsletter, it had to fold. There was no obvious group of black women who were prepared to take it on, although many of us who'd been involved with it for a very long time were prepared to take it on and save it and do it, but we weren't allowed to. And that was the end. Gone. There were disability politics, there were identity politics around class, which had similar effects. I mean, at some points in the 1980s, the politics around class got quite difficult to the point of, in some cases, physical violence and various problems. So identity politics were a problem. So by the end of the 1980s, we'd lost all of that. It happened with the London Lesbian Archive too. Identity politics questions caused that to go after several years, and I was involved in the London Lesbian Archive. So that's where it went. So, okay, so where are we now? I don't know what any of that means for today, except that I can see some of these things starting to develop again. I can see some of these, because the youngsters have not been through it. They don't know what happens, and so I see some of these things starting to happen. So the biggest challenge I see now is the creation of theory. And at the time, the groups that were writing position papers that I was in were things like the Revolutionary Feminist Anti-Pornography Consciousness Raising Group, which I know is a very, very long title. It was the first anti-pornography group in Britain, and we wrote and we did presentations and so on. The Patriarchy Study Group, which met at weekends, 6 weekends in a year, all of us in somebody's house sleeping on the floor. The Leeds Revolutionary Feminist Group that did the political lesbian paper, Lesbians Against Sadomasochism, and so on. So these groups got together and we wrote things together. And I have to say, when I first went to Australia at the beginning in 1991, even though I'd got 2 books out just under my own name, I found it very, very hard because I didn't have any groups to put my ideas in front of, or with no discussion groups at all. It became just me. Right? So I would like those kinds of groups to happen again. Okay, and that's it for now.